This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome to Killer Innovations. I'm your host, Phil McKinney. We are here in the mobile studio at the Consumer Electronics Show here in Las Vegas. And we have another repeat guest, Bob O'Donnell. So, Bob, welcome. Thanks for taking the time out of this craziness out here called CES.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Happy to be here again and happy to reconnect with my old Glenwood buddy.
Yeah. For those of you who don't recall, we shared the story a little bit last year's show. Bob is a long-term one of the top 5 analysts in Silicon Valley. Covered the PC space for many, many years, which impacted me when I was at HP. And it turns out that Bob and I reconnected when I was at HP, but Bob and I ended up going to junior high and high school together.
Yes.
On the south side of Chicago. So we always have this little fun jab about, doing shout outs to the old gang.
Exactly.
Down in Glenwood.
And a factoid that even long-time listeners probably don't know is that Phil was a decent baritone player.
Yeah, I was first chair baritone. I have to remind Bob, I was first chair baritone. He was second chair trombone.
That was only briefly in my battle with Bob Caruso. But anyway.
So you've been out roaming around the show here at CES. So what are you seeing that's kind of interesting? I mean, it's packed.
It is packed.
It is nuts.
It is nuts. And, obviously the show just continues to grow in terms of its relevance and its areas, and you've got the wacky gadgets as you've had for a long time. Obviously, automotive has become huge. More and more robotics this year. We can talk more about that a little bit. But, one fascinating takeaway, and since you brought up age, and this really kind of hit me, is that ironically, some of the biggest announcements, I think, this year and some of the biggest noise has actually been from the old school categories of PCs and TVs, and those are the 2 largest categories from a revenue perspective that exist in consumer electronics. People often forget that. And they still drive, the bulk of the purchases in terms of dollars spent. And the other interesting thing about them, all the announcements were incremental, right? There were no breakthrough announcements. I did just come from the AMD press conference where they announced their first 7-nanometer GPU, which is great. But really, at the end of the day, all of these things are relatively incremental. And I think that's also a reflection of where the consumer electronics industry is as a whole. I think there have been times where we've had a kind of big jumps and then kind of, more evolutionary, and then jumps and then evolutionary. And I feel like we're on the cusp of some big ones, I think, but we're just on the cusp. And a lot of the stuff this year I thought was kind of interesting in terms of it being more evolutionary enhancements in these areas. We saw 8K TV, which I would argue is real. It's kind of an evolutionary. A ton of people announcing 8K, even though there's no 8K. We saw obviously advances, on everything from NVIDIA and Intel and AMD, and then all the system guys announcing new systems, and a ton on gaming, because PC gaming is a huge deal, and there's a lot of that, and some hints of what I think is going to be really big, which is game streaming. And I think we're a little bit early on some of that, but there were some interesting.
Well, I don't know. You look at the volume of video traffic over Twitch. It's huge.
It's that, but I'm talking about actually delivering the game. So in other words, a Netflix for games, where I can play any game. So
you're doing cloud-based gaming.
It's a cloud-based.
Therefore, I don't have to pay. I'm in the middle of a major upgrade on my BlackBerry, as an example. Which is, you're going to drop $3,000 on doing a PC upgrade for a gaming rig. You don't need to do that.
You're not necessarily. Now, look, you're never going to get, the exact same experience as when you have the latest generation card there. But for a lot of people, the ability to be able to play a game, like at the AMD press conference, they talked about their deal with Google to do for the Google Stream system, where you're going to be able to play from a Chrome browser on anything and get 1080p 60 frames per second on some AAA type games, regardless of what kind of device hardware you have. That's great, because what it does is it introduces more people to the opportunity to play these games. And the ones who really get into it then will get a dedicated rig. but it gives you the flexibility also, when we think about cloud-based gaming, to start something on a session somewhere, and then if you move around onto another device or you're traveling, pick it up on a different device that doesn't necessarily have the same level of horsepower.
Right.
So anyway, I think that's an interesting thing. So that was one of the big takeaways, was this kind of sense of what's going on. And then we start to see things like, obviously LG showed their rollable last year, the foldable TV, rollable, whatever we want to call it.
How many years have I been showing flexible displays?
I know, exactly. But now they're going to actually announce it. They announced it's going to be a real product. That was the difference. So I thought that was an interesting development as well. But again, sort of, I would argue, more of an incremental thing within the big category. Other interesting news in TVs, of course, was the Apple iTunes and HomeKit integration with a lot of the big TV players. So for years, Apple's had, obviously, not only not a physical presence, but not much of a real presence at CES. After the early days when a huge portion of CES would be Apple accessories, that's kind of all died down. I mean, it's there, but it's not as big a deal.
Right.
And so Apple's influence on the show really kind of waned. Now, all of a sudden, they've finally opened up HomeKit and iTunes to be software-based. And they announced the deal with Samsung for iTunes, and then with Samsung, Sony, LG, and Vizio for HomeKit and AirPlay 2. And eventually, I think you're going to see iTunes on those platforms as well.
Well, they've also announced Apple TV app.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. It's the Apple TV iTunes app on all these
devices. Yep.
And when Apple announces their streaming service, as they're expected to later this year, all of a sudden, all of these smart TVs will be able to play it without having to buy an Apple TV box. So that was actually a very interesting, but again, incremental kind of discussion, but also highlights, streaming and the importance of, that's what we're going to see in terms of streaming, not only video content, as I said, I think apps. So to me, again, pulling it back, it's about the evolution of these mainstream categories, integrating some of the new stuff, the cloud-based thing, and kind of giving us a different view of where we're going overall.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, we're seeing, 8K, there were some 16Ks, on the floor. And in my view, everybody always asks, is this going to drive like a consumer rush to like when everybody upgraded to HD, right? Yeah. But HD was a different form factor. Yeah. It was a big step up. You go from HD to even 4K, you roughly run 50-50 with consumers being able to tell the difference. Right. And what we find actually, or what at least my opinion is color actually has a bigger impact on the perception of resolution than resolution does.
Absolutely. And the reason why 4K TVs are doing so well now is because they're 4K HDR.
HDR, the high dynamic range.
And that's the thing that is getting people to go up to 4K. Because you're right. On the resolution side, you have to be really big, super big screens, or super close in some cases to tell. But color makes a big deal. So the concern with 8K is, well, look, you already got HDR on 4K. So all you're really getting with 8K is that extra resolution. And oh, by the way, right now there's zero content. So what you're doing is making up pixels. You're upscaling, existing 4K content to these screens. So, and the interesting thing on the 8K front is we're getting a very, as expected, an enormous range of solutions. Some vendors have been really discreet about how to separate 8K from 4K. Others are just like, they're throwing 8K across the line. And I think that's going to confuse people. And I dug in this a little bit. So, for example, Sony, their only 8K TVs are larger than their 4K. So there's a very discreet, simple way to say, look, if you want an 88 or I think a 95, I forget the exact, I know it's crazy. But if you want something that big, then we'll give you 8K, right? And you figure anybody who wants a TV that big probably wants 8K. So,
and they got the means to pay for it.
Exactly. So that makes sense. But with a lot of these other vendors, they're doing 55 or 65. That's the mainstream of 4K. So it's like, well, wait a minute. Now, how do you sell? That really, I think, confuses matters. So we'll see what happens. But again, none of it's going to matter until there's 8K content, and that's a long way off.
Well, I think actually it's going to come around sooner because in the case of the work that we do at Cable Labs, one of our members, JCOM, Japan, the whole push to 8K is because it's a regulatory requirement in Japan for the 2020 Olympics. So the 2020 Olympics, cable operators and broadcasters in Japan have to be able to transmit 8K content because they're going to shoot it in 8K, right? So it again, you could argue whether that's a good regulatory push to drive innovation or not such a good thing, but it gets a lot of attention, and it's getting a huge amount of attention in Japan in the ramp up to the 2020 Olympics. We're going to take another quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Bob O'Donnell, talking about what are all the new and exciting and interesting things happening in Las Vegas here at the Consumer Electronics Show. You're listening to Killer Innovations on the BizTalk Radio Network. Welcome back to Killer Innovations. We're continuing our conversation with Bob O'Donnell. So, Bob, we were talking before about the whole 8K, 4K, and the transition there. You were talking before about really the drive to incremental. One of the things I am noticing at CES this year is the show's always expanded. It started off being a pure CE show.
Yeah.
Now, you can literally find, if it's got a microprocessor in it, it's here.
Yeah.
Right? We were, yesterday morning, I was giving a private tour to executives of the show floor before the floor actually opened. A little easier to navigate. And went over to the Bell booth. Have you seen this thing?
Yes.
And so it's a personal helicopter.
I thought it was going to be a taxi, but it's a massive.
It's massive.
It's massive.
It's massive, but it's gorgeous.
Oh, yeah.
Sit inside of it.
I didn't.
The interior is unbelievable. See, if you're not familiar, Bell makes helicopters. And you see them all the time. News groups use them for helicopter traffic reports, but then executives also own them to shuttle between buildings and those kinds of things. And this is supposed to be eventually to be the platform that becomes autonomous, as a taxi service type of a thing. And the first release of it, though, will have actual pilots in it. But I'm thinking something smallish, right? When I first they sometimes they even refer to it as a flying car.
Yeah.
Well, that would be more like a flying truck.
Exactly.
This thing is, the down rotors, it's 4 rotors. Each rotor's 8 feet in diameter. So you act as a helicopter, and when you're up in the air, then it goes 90 degrees and flies like a plane. It means gorgeous, but holy smokes.
Well, you're exactly right. And again, even despite what I said earlier, there are always a few of those interesting things that do really point to the future.
Yeah, but it's interesting. The interesting thing is it's not in the CE space.
Yeah,
you get some of this a little bit peripheral, but we're seeing a lot of autonomous vehicles here. Is kind of being AI, obviously.
Right. Well, but here's the interesting thing on the autonomous vehicle side. What I noticed very distinctly is, remember 2 years back, everybody was like, oh man, we're going to have level 5 autonomous cars in 2020. Like, it was just like a done deal. And all of a sudden we're like, oh yeah, no, that is not going to happen. And instead, everybody's now talking about level 2+. And we're all of a sudden back to, much more of an assisted driving capability. And frankly, I think it's a good thing. Because look, we know the technology is not ready. They can say what they want. It is not ready. Look, and when technology is not ready in this case, people die. This is not like, oh, Jesus.
I get a blue screen of death and I got to reboot my PC.
And unfortunately, we've seen this. There have been vehicular deaths caused by autonomous cars not doing what they're supposed to be doing because they're not really autonomous. And so, and there's been this recognition and this pullback and people going, wait a minute, we've got to get this stuff right. And the challenges are, there's so many issues. There's a huge trust issue, right? There's been studies done. People do not trust. And now you've got people in Arizona attacking these Waymo vans.
The Waymo vans, they're throwing trash cans at it. They're smashing the windows on them.
This, you got to say, now, obviously some of that's crazy, but at the same time, does it reflect this fear that people have around this? Obviously it does. But there was even more compelling data that I read about recently. Apparently, IIHS, the Institute of Highway Safety or something, did a study that came out in August. And it said between 60 and 80% of the current auto assist functions were being disengaged. And and disengagement can be two different things. One is automatic disengagement because the car gets to a situation it doesn't know what to do, and so you're supposed to take over. And the transition, of course, is hugely problematic. But number two, a lot of it is people who try these systems, and then it doesn't work the way I expect it to, or it causes problems, and so they manually disengage. So there's a recognition that we're not even ready on this assisted stuff, and yet it can do a lot of help. I've argued, I wrote an article for USA Today probably a year and a half ago where I said, look, we don't need fully autonomous cars to do the safety stuff. Everybody's talking about, autonomous cars will save lives. Guess what? Assisted driving will save lives too, but you got to do it right. So as an example, I was talking to someone recently about this. With some of these lane keeping technologies, right. There was an example of a guy, apparently a reviewer in Germany. They were going, there was a biker along the side of a road. And like all of us, you tend to swerve around a biker, right? You don't turn on your turn signal, you just swerve around a biker. Well, apparently the system saw it as someone trying to leave the lane, pulled them back, didn't see the bike, and almost ran into the biker, right? And another story that I was talking, our buddy Mike Nash at HP was talking about an experience he had that his son had. They had a new car that had this, and the son was, again, he was pulling into one of those middle lanes where you can turn, and the system kept pulling him back. And so it got so annoying, he just turned it off, and they stopped using it.
Actually, my wife's the same way, because like, we both have Ford Explorers, right? And I love the lane assist. I love the adaptive cruise and all that. My wife just bought a 2018, right at the end of the year. And the first thing she did was turned it off. She hated driving my car with it on. And with her car, she immediately deactivated it because she hates that. She just hated it because the same thing. She goes to change the lanes and she feels like she's fighting with the car, etc. But it causes an interesting challenge for my wife and I. Because when I get in her car, it looks the same as mine. We both have Explorers. I expect it. So like I've had into some situations where I'm assuming, I'm in my car, and I think it has adaptive cruise, which means I don't have to worry about braking coming up on a car. So I'm not quick to stomp on the brake until all of a sudden I realize, oh no, I don't have adaptive cruise, and I'm coming up on a car pretty quick.
And that, and think about that from, for people who travel from a rental car perspective, right? People are going to have rental cars that they think have these features, maybe because they're used to them or they've gone out of the habit. I mean, there are some big questions that are going to have to be asked and answered. And the other problem is I have a real issue with is I love NVIDIA and I love what Jensen Huang does and the technology those guys do for cars is amazing. They just announced a new level 2+ system they call autopilot. But just as with Tesla, because Tesla also called theirs autopilot, I have a real problem with the word autopilot in a car because it implies that it's truly autopilot, right? And it's not. It's helpful, assisted pilot. And to call it autopilot, I think sets expectations improperly. And so again, a lot of this is about the expectations, the reality of what the technology can or cannot do. So that's why, again, overall, to bring it back a full circle to what I had said at the beginning, I think this autonomous car story is evolving a lot at the CES with much more focus on safety and more realistic timeframes of much longer for any kind of full autonomy.
Well, I think it brings up an interesting point. Maybe we pick it up in the next segment, which is being careful about setting expectations. Oversell it, then you will turn them off of technology for years where they won't get near it. We're going to take another quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Bob O'Donnell here at CES Las Vegas. You're listening to Killer Innovations on the BizTalk Radio Network. Well, welcome back. We are here in Las Vegas at CES. So, Bob, we were talking before about, the issues of not overhyping innovations, which is always the problem, right? Everyone wants to way oversell it. We're seeing it all over the floor. Like AI has been the buzzword for 3 years now at CES. You can't walk anywhere and somebody doesn't have AI attached to every product, on the floor. And now we're seeing things like 5G being attached to everything on the floor. And, and the problem is consumers, people who are going to take advantage of these innovations, get a little burned out from kind of the overhype problem.
Well,
do you think it's an issue?
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge issue. And, you know, it's particularly bad right now around 5G here in the US because you've got, frankly, what I would argue are pretty deceptive discussions of what 5G is. First of all, you got Verizon announcing a 5G system initially that was not 5G standard. Now you've got AT&T doing 5G evolution, which is really gigabit LTE 4.5G. But, you know, and then you got all the other carriers jumping on, you know, Laguerre at T-Mo pasting the little thing saying, hey, we're 9G. Now, but I'm going to turn around on you. I get to ask Phil the question because all of a sudden the cable guys come out and said, oh, we're 10G. Not 10 GBS, which is what you really should have called it. But anyway.
Well, the problem is the consumers don't know what GBS
I get it.
is.
I know, because we're talking gigabits per second, FYI. But look, it is, you know, and it's an interesting thing, right? I mean, the cable industry is in a spot that is tough because there's a lot of talk about cord cutting and everything else. So I get why you guys are doing it. But there is that, all of a sudden, that expectation of what all of this means. Because, you know, of course, 5G doesn't really mean 5 gigabits per second. Whereas you guys are calling 10G because it is theoretically 10
Well, I
gigabits
think the
per
difference also with what we announced on Monday with the 10G program is the fact that it's live today. You know, it's not a theoretical, you're going to get 5G 3 years from now, right? So we announced on Monday that in the U.S., 80% of all U.S. homes now can buy 1 gigabit service. And that's more north of 100 million homes. And from 2016, it was 4% of homes. And that technology that delivers 1 gig is the exact same technology that ramps to delivering 10 gig. So there's nothing left to invent. It's simply just the rollout and deployment, that really being the difference.
Well, and although I would argue 5G's got the same issue, right? I mean, the technology, now that we have the 5G in our standard and we've got millimeter wave and sub-6 starting to happen, you know, it's a rollout issue.
Well, and the thing we talk about, though, is, you know, everybody likes to pit innovations against each other, right? It's A&D against Intel.
Yeah.
It's Qualcomm against, you know, whoever, right?
Sure.
Pretty much everybody. You know, whatever. And people, you know, even this week, can't tell you how many questions I fielded on, oh, are you guys trying to, you know, stick one of the 5G guys? Well, in reality, it's complementary. In fact, if you looked under the hood at the technologies, we announced some work that's now actually part of a public standard that allows for DOCSIS, which is the protocol in a cable plant, to be used for small cell backhaul. We made changes working with the 5G vendors so that they can take small cells, strand mount them on the side of a pole, plug right into the cable network, and use it as their backhaul. And that's key. So it's really complementary versus this 5G. Is it 5G or 10G? No, it's really 5G and 10G.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really important clarification. The problem is it's a subtlety that not everybody's going to get from
Exactly.
it. And because whenever they hear G, when it comes to communications, they think wireless network.
Right.
But,
Well, in our case, you know, the question we always get is, you know, what the heck are people going to do with 1 gigabit, much less 10 gigabits? And the way I describe that also is we're trying to create a platform for others to innovate on top of.
Right.
Right? Because if you look back to when, you know, always on broadband, when the very first cable modems came out, and you got 1.5, you know, megabits. Ooh, that was fast because that was the equivalent of a T1.
Right.
You know, for consumers. And then you got to 5 and 10 and 25. There was nobody could use 25. Right. But by the fact that there was 25, then you actually resulted in the innovations of things like YouTube and Netflix. So we don't know where it's going to be. And we announced that for 10G, for 10 gigabits, will be in field trials in 2020. Right. We're in 2019 now. Right? So really, this is an encouragement to say, innovators, what is it you want to do? What is it you can invent that can take advantage of these kinds of capacities?
Well, and I think the interesting thing is I do think streaming is going to be incredibly important. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. I think game streaming, there's an enormous opportunity for people to start doing streaming of games. And I think that's going to suck up a lot of bandwidth as well.
Exactly. And actually, what we're seeing in our prediction is 70% of all internet traffic will be some form of video streaming.
Right.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why 10G is also symmetrical. It's 10 gig up, 10 gig down, because you got these gamers who now are capturing this high quality, and they need to get it into the network.
Well, and the other thing, and to bring it in back to 5G a bit as well, is, the big deal these days now is not just speed, it's latency, right? It's that delay issue. And that's where we're starting to see people talk about here at this show a little bit and moving forward, that one of the interesting things about 5G, and I'm sure probably for 10G as well, is not just the speed, but it's that latency or delay issue. Because that all of a sudden allows certain things to happen that you couldn't do before.
Exactly.
And so we're starting to see people talk about, but even there, I mean, part of the problem is you got some of these 5G guys say, oh, well, we got 1 millisecond latency. Like, seriously? Like, it's not physically possible.
You can't violate the law of physics. Speed of light is still the speed of light. And if that data center is in California and you're sitting in London, you are not going to be at 1 millisecond.
I mean, it's just I kind of scratch my head at that stuff. But anyway, point is, there was a lot of 5G talk here.
Yep.
And some of it, a lot of it is around the speed, but some of it is around this, the new potential capabilities. And again, I think that, just as 4G and LTE ended up enabling things like Uber and other services we could never even dream of. That's the hope and thought around 5G. And it's interesting. I think part of the reason why there's always a lot of attention when there's a new wireless network. They only happen once every 10 years, but I think 5G is getting even more of focus because people now understand what an important difference 4G made in terms of enabling new things. So 5G becomes that much more important. Also, the more the reason why the people who are not really doing 5G are getting so much more grief for confusing the matter. Because I think there's a lot more sensitivity to the fact, like, don't do that, because we want to make sure people understand what the value and what real 5G actually is.
You're commenting specifically to the open letter that one of the carriers published, basically slapping down one of the other carriers. Don't exaggerate.
Well, of course. I mean, it's bad form.
Well, it's bad form, and it taints the industry. It taints the consumer perception.
Yeah, it totally does. And that's, I think that's a challenge. And frankly, I'll be honest, I think that's a challenge you guys are going to face on the 10G thing too, because some people are going to get confused on that. So you're going to,
what's interesting is like, we've been talking about it. Once we can actually explain it, particularly to analysts or to reporters, they get it and they go, okay, now I can describe the difference, right? No. If you just go out and just say, oh, we're now called 10G, and everybody goes, well, what happened to 6, 7, 8, 9?
No, and again, it's like you said, it's a complementary story if once you understand it, but it's getting the word out so people can understand how these technologies are going to work together. And, then this starts to bring in things around edge computing and other kinds of really
we could have a long conversation. Yeah. I'm a big fan on edge compute.
Absolutely.
I think what some of the companies are doing, like HP now going big into edge computing, it's clearly the right thing to do.
No, absolutely. And I think we're going to see that. And the other interesting thing that starts to enable from a consumer perspective, and we've seen a little bit of this here, but not as much as I thought, is the idea of doing AI on edge devices, which means I don't have to send all my data to the cloud. And so there starts to get, you start to do some AI either directly on a device or on an edge, but not all the way back to the data center. And that starts to enable some better data privacy issues long term. Again, that one's going to take a while for people to suss through it all, but I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Perfect. So, Bob, if any of the listeners want to keep track of what you're working on and the articles you're posting, because I know you post in a lot of different places.
I do.
Where's the best place for them to keep track of you?
My website is www.technalysisresearch. It's a tough one. .com, but think of the word analysis, take off the A, put tech in front, and research. Technalysis Research.
We'll have the link in the show notes.
Exactly. But I also, and look for me in USA Today, is the sort of big mainstream stuff, and I do a lot on Bloomberg TV and other places.
Right. So we'll have links to everything, also to some of Bob's more recent articles, which have been very good. And Bob, thanks again for taking the time and joining us here at CES.
Always a pleasure.
And we'll be right back after this quick commercial break. This segment of the show is what I call 5 Minutes to New Ideas, designed for the creative mind looking for that next great idea. Each episode will challenge you to think differently about yourself, your business, and your product and services by asking unique, funny, and sometimes crazy questions. These questions are designed to force you to look beyond the obvious and to uncover ideas and opportunities you never before considered. So get out your notebook and be ready to uncover that game-changing idea. Here is 5 minutes to new ideas. We tend to assume that any customer is a good customer. However, if you find that you're working like crazy, have a solid and reliable customer base, but you're still not making the profits you expected, then you need to ask the question, who do I not want to use my product? Do you remember back when dial-up internet services first started to transition to the mainstream? All the way back, yes, in the early 90s, companies like AOL, CompuServe, The Source, Earthlink all began offering access to the web that was billed, yes, by the minute. The more you used, the more you paid. Logical, right? These three companies essentially offer the same product on the same terms. Very quickly, the people who used the services they offered divided into two camps. The majority logged on once or twice a day. They checked their email, read some sports stats, caught up on a little gossip, and then quickly logged off. However, a small minority logged on for hours or even days at a time. These people quickly ran up bills into the thousands. Now, pop quiz, is this a good thing or a bad thing for your business? These high-volume users love your service, but paradoxically, their passion for what you offer will almost inevitably force them to stop or drive them into an untenable situation if they try to continue. So, if you were running AOL, CompuServe, The Source, Earthlink, what would you have done? Continue the same pricing structure that strongly disfavored your most ardent users? Or figure out some way to continue improving profits without punishing the people who really, really love what you do? In other words, would you decide to keep or push out these high-use customers? In the end, AOL was the first to take a radical step to address these questions. In 1996, they switched from a pay-per-minute system to a flat-rate fee. Now, this was daring and audacious move because they risked seriously alienating low-usage customers who were used to paying less than $20 a month. On the flip side, they had to massively upgrade their infrastructure in order to accommodate the demand. AOL was bombarded with complaints about busy signals and slow speed. Users joked that AOL stood for always offline. For a short while, it looked like they might have a poor decision, that they should go back and rethink that. However, this new flat rate fee addressed a fundamental fear that even low usage customers had with the old pricing formula. Namely, not knowing how much that monthly cost was going to be. AOL's new strategy took away that stress that came with worrying about the bill. Parents no longer had to hover over their kids and nag them about getting offline. The result was that the company shot ahead of all the others and became the leading ISP through to the early 2000s. The other companies, Earthlink, CompuServe, The Source, Prodigy, quickly copied AOL's new pricing structure. But AOL had that huge advantage of being the first mover. Their competitors looked like copiers, where AOL looked like a game changer. They won that round. In the early days of the mobile industry, telecom companies grappled with similar issues with their cell phone customers, hogging the bandwidth in a given area. Parents would toss a cell phone into their baby's crib, dial another cell phone from it, and keep the line open all night, using it as a baby monitor under the free evenings and weekends pricing promotions that were quite popular in the early days of mobile. More recently, people have used their smartphones as jerry-rigged security systems by streaming constant live footage from their office or home security cameras while they are on vacation. Anyone who's experienced problems with AT&T's network or Verizon in urban areas can understand why this might be an issue. So, are these customers abusive? Do you want them? Should you even think about penalizing them for using vastly more than their share of the network and compromising the connectivity of other users? If I were still working in the wireless industry, I'd be looking at ways to understand and migrate the high-volume users into an elite program. My feeling is that if someone loves what you do and uses it habitually, then that's a customer you want to hold on to. If what you see as abuse is actually foresight, being ahead of that curve, then you might be looking at a future revenue stream rather than a problem. You just haven't figured out how to separate out their use, given its own program apart from the existing customer agreement, and then how to monetize it. In this situation, it's worth taking the time to figure out a way to find a satisfactory medium between their needs and yours. So ask yourself, who do I not want to use my product now, but may want to in the future? And don't stop at the obvious answer. I'm Phil McKinney, and thanks for listening. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join in. If you have any comments or suggestions, drop me a note over at phil@killerinnovations.com. Now, the reason I've been doing this show since 2005 is to pay back my early mentor by paying it forward. My first mentor, Bob Davis, invested an immense amount of time in training and coaching me, which had a major impact on my career. When I went back and asked him how I could pay him back, he just laughed and said I couldn't. I had to pay it forward. If I could ask for a favor, could you help me pay it forward? How? 1, give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts, as that helps spread the word. And 2, by telling others about the show. This episode of Killer Innovations was produced by the Innovators Network. You can find the show notes and the entire show catalog over at killerinnovations.com. I'll talk to you next week. In the meantime, go out and change the world with your killer innovation. Bye-bye.